Well, beloved, last week in the reading from Hebrews, we heard, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And I know that ever since you've heard that, you have just been burning to know who was this Melchizedek guy. It's kept you awake all week long. We've been reading the book of Hebrews. I often preach on the gospel, so we kind of miss what's going on in the Old Testament or the Epistle. But we've been reading through the book of Hebrews for quite a while now in this cycle. And the book of Hebrews is kind of an enigma as far as who wrote it and who it's written to. Early church fathers had different opinions. Clement and Origen thought that the content was Paul's, but there's an obvious style difference between the letter of Hebrews and Paul's letters, so we're pretty sure that it wasn't Paul. Tertullian thought that it was probably Barnabas, who was an associate of Paul's. But in any case, by about the 5th century, the Western Church had attributed it to Paul. And what we can tell just from the content is that it's a person who's extremely well-versed in Jewish life. He doesn't have to explain Jewish festivals or such. It's a person who is Greek-educated, because when he quotes the Old Testament, he's using the Greek version of the Old Testament rather than the Hebrew. And he has really excellent rhetoric, so he's highly educated. And he's writing to a community with some understanding of Jewish worship. He doesn't have to do some of these explanations you find in the Gospels of what a particular feast means. And he's writing at a time when the temple still exists and sacrifices are still being made, because he refers to it as if it's something that's currently going on. Now, we don't know why the letter is written. Paul's letters are pretty clear. They say, I have heard that you're doing this bad thing, and I would like you to do this. All we really hear in Hebrews is that there's dropping attendance at church. So maybe that's why it's written, but we don't really know. But the intent is to put Jesus into context with the Hebrew Scriptures. Specifically, how does Jesus' sacrifice work in with the sacrifices made at the temple? Because the temple is the center of Jewish life. Judaism at the time of Jesus is really diverse. We often think of the Jews at the time of Jesus, but there were many, many different movements within Judaism. But what they all held in common was a obsession with the temple. Either they support the temple leadership or they don't support the temple leadership. It's the commonality that draws them all together. So the question is, how does Jesus relate to that center? And the writer of Hebrews says, well, Jesus is a priest, and he's more than just a priest. He's a high priest. And this is significant. There can only be one high priest at the temple, and the high priest is the only one who, on the day of Yom Kippur, the day of the atonement, can offer the red bull. And we're not talking about the energy drink here. We're talking about an actual red bull who would be sacrificed to take the sins of the people. But there's a problem with calling Jesus a high priest, because Jesus doesn't have the right genealogy to be a high priest, because all the priests come from the tribe of Levi. And Jesus, through Joseph, comes from the tribe of Judah, which is the tribe of King David. So how can he possibly be a priest if he's not of the right priestly family? So the writer of Hebrews searches the Scriptures, and he brings out this story of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a person in the Abrahamic saga. At one point, Abraham comes upon Melchizedek, and all the Old Testament tells us is that he is a priest of the Most High God. Whatever is going on there, Abraham recognizes him as being a priest of the same God, has Melchizedek bless him, and gives him 10% of everything he owns. He gives him a tithe. So, the writer of Hebrews says, since Melchizedek accepted Abraham's sacrifice and blessed him, this is a higher order of priesthood than the Levitical priesthood. You see what the Hebrews is doing here? It's kind of convoluted, but he's making an interesting point. But wait, there is more. Reading today, priests have to offer sacrifice day after day, first for their sins and for the congregation, and eventually they die and have to be replaced by more priests. But Jesus, due to his resurrection, is a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, and his sacrifice atones for all. Now, for the Jewish community of Jesus' time, that was really all you needed to say. For those Jews who had become Christians, this all made perfect sense. Every culture of the time believed that gods required sacrifices. And while Israel believed in one God, they still believed that God required blood sacrifice. So to them, Jesus was a simple substitution for the sacrifice of the temple. But what do we think about that? After all, we don't tend to think that God desires blood sacrifice. So what did Jesus do on the cross then? Yes, we affirm that Jesus died for our sins, but why did he need to do that, and how did that work? This is a branch of theology called atonement theory. It's kind of an obsession of the Western church, and there's never really been a consensus. I have to do an aside here that people in the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Oriental Orthodox churches have never gotten into this kind of angels on the head of a pin argument. You know, they just say it's all about the glory of God and the rest of it will let go. But for us as Westerners, in the scientific, in the Enlightenment way of thinking, this kind of stuff is at least interesting, if not very important. And there have been several families of theories about how this works, and there's never really been a consensus. There's the restoration model that was thought up first in 318, or the moral example model thought up first in 1079. But the leading theory, the one that you still hear articulated the most, is what's called the theory of satisfaction, that was first articulated in 1033 by Anselm of Canterbury. And what's significant about this is you have to understand the context that it comes from. This is medieval society. So in medieval society, you have classes, you have peasants, you have knights, you have lords, you have the king over all of them, and you don't move between those classes. There's not much social mobility between the classes. You are chosen by God to be in one of those classes when you're born into it. And each one, and they have a concept of honor, a very high concept of honor. This idea that if you offend somebody above you in the pecking order, that they must demand satisfaction. It's not that they can demand satisfaction for their honor being besmirched. They have to demand it, because if they don't, then they admit that they're not at a higher level of the pecking order. So if you were a peasant and you offended the king, you could be executed on the spot. You know, that happened all the time in medieval Europe. So Anselm is thinking about this in terms of God. You know, this is the society he's working in. And Anselm says, well, if God is way above the king, I mean so far above the king that the difference between a king and a peasant is nothing, then how much honor does God have? And if we as human beings have besmirched God's honor, God has to demand satisfaction from us in order to be God. So therefore, he requires the sacrifice of our blood. But Jesus steps in and takes that for us. So God sacrifices himself. In a medieval society, this sounds weird to us, but in a medieval society, this is really merciful and really against the grain. The problem is that this has remained the leading theory of this all the way to today, even among Catholics or evangelicals. So now they don't talk in terms of honor, but they talk about the terms of our sin being so much of an affront in God's sight that God needs a sacrifice, and Jesus steps into that sacrificial role, and his blood atones for us. You know, it's still the same model. It's just that we don't look at society the same way we used to, and it doesn't make as much sense. But it's not the only model. There's another family that the first person who put it forward is Julian of Norwich in the 1300s, who said that the wrath that we think is not actually God's, it's our wrath that Jesus dies to take away. Jesus died not to appease God's need for sacrifice, but our need for sacrifice. And probably the best proponent of this today is a man named Rene Girard. Rene Girard is a French thinker, and he's kind of a Renaissance man. His primary training is actually in literature. So he comes at it from a literary viewpoint of studying comparative mythology, and he looks at all the mythology of all the cultures of the earth. And he says, you know, you can watch this cycle go on in all of the cultures of the earth. And he calls it something he calls mimetic desire, which probably makes it sound more highfalutin than it actually is. Because what it comes down to is scapegoating. Now, we all know that word scapegoat. It means a person who is being blamed for something that they didn't actually do. Somebody that society or a group blames for something that's probably not their fault. But that has an Old Testament connotation. Well, once a year, the priests would heap the sins of the society on the back of the scapegoat and send it out. It was an actual goat. And send it out into the wilderness to die. So that's what that term scapegoat comes from. That's your word of the day. And what he says is, what you can see in this mechanism over and over and again in humanity is this cycle of desire. We all have desires, and some desires aren't bad. We desire food, we desire some amount of security, we desire housing, we desire all these things. But our desires are always more than we can ever accomplish. We want ultimate security, and we can never have that because our lives aren't ultimately under our control. We want all these things, and when we can't get our desires fulfilled, which we never will, we turn to frustration. We become frustrated. And then that frustration moves to contagion. People often wonder about this. This stuff, it's like a virus. This is what he says. It actually works like a virus. But think about it. This happens all the time. You remember Cabbage Patch Kids out back in the 80s? They weren't all that awesome, And when they first came out, people were like, those are the ugliest dolls I've ever seen. But all of a sudden at Christmas time, everybody had to have one. Or when the first Nintendo Entertainment System came out. Or when the newest iPhone comes out. People are always like, I don't need that. Oh, yes, I do. It's this, that we can see that happening in an everyday thing among humanity. Eventually that contagion moves to the place that something has to give, and the scapegoating takes place. We find an external, or we can find an external enemy, an internal enemy to transfer the blame onto, so we can then sacrifice the scapegoat. That doesn't necessarily mean killing it. It could be a political sacrifice, it could be a social sacrifice, it could be a monetary sacrifice. And then what that sacrifice does is it allows us to get rid of the tension and reform community for a period of time until the next desire comes around. And he says if you look in ancient mythology, this goes on again and again and again and again and again. So he traces it through literature, he traces it through anthropology. But where he comes at the end is that he's a practicing Roman Catholic. So he says, the thing that is different is that Jesus is the pivot point of history. Because Jesus is the victim that everybody thinks is innocent. There is nobody in the entire story of the Passion who actually thinks Jesus is guilty of what he's being punished for. Everybody is pretending like he's guilty of something and punishing him for that, but everybody knows he's not actually doing that. But he is the scapegoat. And he's not just any human, he's God himself. And Girard says that actually has a cosmic effect on us as humans. That Jesus breaks the cycle. He creates a ferment. A ferment is like yeast going into the dough that continually decreases the efficacy of sacrificial violence. He says this is why this sacrifice seems so foreign to us. It doesn't mean that we do this cycle less. He says, in fact, it means we do it more, because every time we do it, it's less efficacious, because this is working within our psyches. So we do it more and more. The cycle is becoming shorter and shorter because each one works less. And this is why that sacrifice seems foreign to us. It's why atonement theory is needed, because for most of human history, the need for a sacrifice to God was self-evident. And through the work of Jesus, it no longer seems so. In order to live together as humans, we have to build community. And there are several different ways you can do it. But the fastest, easiest, and most popular way to do it is to use an external enemy, or if none is available, the scapegoat mechanism. Because nothing brings people together easier than an enemy in common to fight against. If you can't find an external enemy, take someone from your community and make them the other. If you want to see it in operation, just turn on the television and watch it in action from both sides of the current political divide. Who is the evil one according to the particular channel you're watching? Is it Obama? Is it Trump? Is it Clinton? Is it Walker? Which one of these is the primal embodiment of evil? Which one of these is the primal embodiment of evil that if they get their way will destroy America? The elections are just over a year away and we're already at each other's throats again, enabling this scapegoat mechanism. And no matter who controls the executive, legislative, and judicial branches when everything finishes, we're still going to face the staggering issues that we have both at home and abroad. We pretend that if we just get the right people in power, it will all somehow miraculously work out. and we make the other side a scapegoat for all that is wrong, and we spend all of our time blaming particular people rather than actually working on the issues. And the problem with appointing a scapegoat is that it's fleeting. As Girard notes, after the destruction of the scapegoat, it unifies the community for a short period of time until the tension begins to build again and another has to be found. And we ignore the fact that no party is going to get a true supermajority of public support. So ultimately, we will all have to work together, respect each other, and reach hard compromises. There's a better model, and it's the model that Jesus himself enacted on the cross. And it's a model that he asked us to reenact as often as we would do it. We call it the Great Thanksgiving, lift up your hearts. Because we give of ourselves in the offertory. We make a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. It's not out of guilt, but out of joy of the gift of new life that Jesus gives us now. And then that joy is returned to us in bread and wine. And with that transformation should come a transformed understanding of what we are about in the world. One of the things I love about how we pray right now is that since we mentioned President Obama and Governor Walker, we are all challenged to pray for someone we probably dislike every Sunday. And when we come to the communion rail, we stand and kneel with people from a variety of viewpoints. This is the kind of sacrifice that God wishes, not the sacrifice of the other, whom we count as opposition in order to make the rest of us feel more united, but a sacrifice of our wrath, of our need to feel justified, of our lust for power. The joyful offering of ourselves to the God who loved us so much that he was willing to give himself in order that we could break our cycles of wrath and destruction. Amen.